My name is Joel, and I'm an addict. My recovery date, or my clean date, is May 2nd, 2005. Now, I say I'm an addict because I was taught to identify myself as that, but over time, I internalized the truth of that is that I have a internal condition. You can call it a disease, you can call it whatever you like, but it is something that I will always have. I'll have it to different degrees, and the symptoms may come and go, but I will always have it. And I believe that that's an important thing for me to remember as I go through life, trying to make sure that I don't return to the state I was in before May 2nd, 2005. What happens these days is that you have people out there in the community who want to help and want to understand what it means to be in recovery. And they can't because it's difficult for them to come and learn about recovery, because in order to learn, probably ideally, they would have to come and attend meetings the way a person in recovery attends meetings. And they have other things to do. But what happens is when people try to talk about their recovery, they talk about it in ways that to me appear like it's magical thinking. Like, in other words, that something just magical happened. You go to these meetings and, you just are able to stay, what we call stay clean or stay abstinent. And there is a definite need for people to understand what recovery is out there in the world. So I wanted to try to explain what happened to me. And as I try to explain it, it becomes incredibly difficult because we have different definitions of these things, and words have different meanings for different people. And there's a lot of societal baggage that goes into talking about things that are powerful sources of pleasure. Drugs and alcohol is a drug, in my belief. That goes for all things that are powerful pleasures. Sex is an incredibly difficult thing to talk about. And the rules and regulations and norms in any society around sex are difficult to talk about. So we're dealing with a phenomenon where individuals develop a relationship with powerful things outside themselves, in this case, drugs, and that relationship often destroys them. Now, the most important takeaway, I would hope, from this audio would be that it is not the substances themselves, although their power should not be underestimated. It's not the substances themselves that are the cause of the condition. They trigger something, and that's my sincere personal belief, and my own personal experience plays that out. I often have to go back to the central thing that surrounds being a human being when I talk about this. And a lot of people, I think, don't understand it. I'm not trying to act arrogant or anything, because maybe I don't explain it well. And maybe there's not any reference points for them out there in the world. But I firmly and strongly and deeply believe that addiction and recovery at its base, at its fundamental level, involves what it means to be a human being, what it means to face an imperfect existence and to try to make meaning and purpose out of that imperfect existence, what it means to be alive and have obligations to oneself and to one's universe, to one's community, to one's family, to one's higher power, God, to have values, to have rules. So that is where it all starts for me, and that's where it all ends to some extent too. It starts with, I'm here, what am I going to do with myself? And so if we rewind to when I was a child and when I was a teenager, those questions weren't settled well. And those questions of what am I going to do with my life? What am I going to do with the day? Like, what am I going to do when I'm confronted with this wider world? How am I going to handle that? What are going to be my rules? What are going to be my values? How am I going to meaningfully interact with the people around me, with myself, with the world that I'm faced being an alive human? And like most children, that calculation of how I'm going to deal with the world around me was informed by my parents, and then informed by the peer group, and informed by the larger society. And like most children, I was subject to those things. In other words, I hadn't yet reached the age where I could have some ownership over that I could have some autonomy. In other words, I was caused. My choices in large ways were the effect of the circumstances around me. And That doesn't mean as a child you don't have some degree of free will. It's just that your free will is a very different thing. Your ability to make meaningful choices is very different when you're younger. The developmental ideal is that you grow up and you sort through all the values of your surroundings and you have experiences, and through those experiences you get lessons, and then that becomes part of a value system that you can use to operate for the rest of your life. And that process didn't work for me. The big picture is that my value system formation wasn't functional. It didn't work. My values were inconsistent. I didn't understand why I did the things I did. I wasn't able to get down to the core of why I did what I did, and then from there make better decisions. So people will talk about in the meetings in the 12-step program that they were an addict long before they picked up drugs. And to me, just for me personally, that sounds like magical thinking. That sounds like you were just, tapped and given this aura, this negative aura, like you're an addict. And I don't think that's the case, but what I do think is that long before substances, drugs were introduced to the picture, that the thing that I just talked about was already present. In other words, an underdeveloped value system, an inability to cope and deal with day-to-day life and other people and self. That was already present. And it being broken the way it was and not functioning the way it was, drugs came in and became an artificial thing that often would feel like it was an antidote to the things that were broken. Drugs and the lifestyle around drugs, especially in the beginning, give people power. It gives people insight. And sometimes the insight is good, and sometimes the experiences are positive. So it usually occurs in the context of social bonding, of peer group formation. So when I started taking drugs, I remember feeling more powerful, feeling more competent, feeling more confident. And through the lifestyle, what I explored was early adulthood, late adolescence is a time of exploration. And I was doing the regular healthy exploration, which is set up through society, which is going to school, and then for some people starting a job, or for others like myself going to college, where you're scrimmaging to some extent, to use a sports metaphor. You're practicing relationships. You're practicing dealing with hierarchies. You're practicing being disciplined. You're practicing setting goals and achieving them. And the lifestyle surrounding drugs for me was another layer of that practice. So I was socializing in that. I was practicing doing things that I was scared of, which is, it sounds really silly, but it was the truth. And it's the truth of my experience that I was scared to do a lot of things that were outside my comfort zone, precisely because I had a broken value system. I didn't have a way to understand what it would look like to experience failure necessarily. But for some reason in that world, in the world of drugs and the early experimentation with drugs, something about that, I guess because there was a payoff, I would feel cool if I took a risk in that world and got some success as defined by that world, but I wasn't scared to do that. So I would take risks. I would take legal risks, and then I would feel better. But meanwhile, on the other side, I wasn't taking necessarily professional risks. I wasn't living in a meaningful way outside my comfort zone. I was going to school, and I was, I was good in school. That was something I knew how to talk about things. I had a good vocabulary. I was well read. And ironically, I was actually pretty teachable and able to listen to orders and commands in that context. In other words, I was a good student. But meanwhile, I leave class and then I was out there breaking laws. So, when the drugs came in, it was just one factor, and I'm a visual guy, and I like looking at things in cycles. So, I'd wake up in the day and I would feel things, and I'd have certain experiences. You throw a drug in there, and each day is supposed to be a learning experience for all humans, not just humans in adolescence. So what happened over time was the drugs became a feature of the cycles of existence for me, and the lifestyle became a cycle. And looking back, once I got clean and started a different cycle where drugs were absent, and I would cycle through different experiences and different emotions, and in that would be value formation once again. I would get certain lessons and I would store them away, and I would understand that if I did A behavior, I would get generally B result. I started to realize that there were so many things that I missed because the drugs themselves were filling certain gaps. And then this is what most people would understand intuitively. And it's obvious that when you put substances that change the way you perceive things, it's going to throw off your perception. But it's deeper than that because there were certain little things that I just didn't learn because the drugs were creating a false holding place for certain things. For example, if someone is bored or they want to do something with their life or they have some challenging task, anything, it could be anything, whether it's trying to pursue happiness or you got to make a certain phone call. I'm one of those cliche people that found it really difficult to call doctors. There's a joke, there's a meme on the internet. I think it says something to the effect that I'm one of those people that still has my mom call the doctor for me and I'm 30 years old or something like that. That's how I was. Like anything that was difficult and uncomfortable, it was easier for me to subcontract that to somebody else. Now, once again, if I had to go down and score large amounts of drugs that I was going to turn around and sell down in the ghetto, I didn't need anybody's help with that necessarily. I could go do that on my own, but I couldn't call a doctor, which showed that underneath there were unexamined insecurities that were contextual. So I felt more comfortable maybe in the ghetto than I did in a professional world. Now, I couldn't unpack any of that because I was using, and the drug would make me feel better about that. So nowadays, if I had to get somebody to do something for me that I should do for myself, I would feel healthy uncomfortability with that. I would feel like you need to go do that yourself, Joel. Like I'd have an internal monologue that would say, Joel, you need to take care of this on your own so you can learn about it. But if I had drugs there, it didn't bother me because I would just be like, maybe I would have the inkling, I would have the first intimations of uncomfortability or discomfort around having my mom call a doctor for me. But I would just go use and that feeling would go away. I would suppress the emotion. That's just one example out of dozens and dozens of opportunities that were missed to learn about myself and learn generally how the world around me works because drugs were a placeholder in the feedback mechanism that life presents us. So we're survival mechanisms on one level biologically. And so dopamine is dispensed when we do something well. Stress hormones are dispensed when there's a threat. So between the reward chemicals and the survival chemicals, most human beings will find those things will be lubrication to figure out what the best way to go about things is. So when they do something that works for them in their world, they'll get dopamine. When they get stressor chemicals, it's usually a signal, well, maybe you need to try something different. Now, that's not always exact because we can get pleasure from things that aren't good for us, and we can get stress hormones and negative experiences from interacting with our world in a way that isn't our fault. But often, these are corrective mechanisms internally that gird us towards finding personal truths. And that process didn't happen for me. I was constantly getting artificial feel-goods that didn't correspond or match to a meaningful lesson from the world around me. And this went deeper than just the drugs because there were certain ways of living that offered me substitute rewards and substitute payoffs for better payoffs. So in romantic relationships, I would find relationships that were easy to get into, where I felt comfortable, where I felt like I was in control. But invariably, and this has carried 20 years, it's been going on for 20 years since I first started dating, this pattern of going about doing things in a way that wasn't ideal or optimal just became internalized. But in the drug lifestyle, it was just get a girlfriend, kind of make her your girlfriend, and if it doesn't work out, go find another girlfriend. And sometimes just pursue sex for its own sake. Stuff that I look back on and I cringe, but I also feel some healthy guilt because it was exploitative to some level. Now, I was being exploited by women too, so it was mutual, but it was just unhealthy. It was not sustainable. It wasn't going to work long term. And this is where the conflict of values is so important because I had a larger culture to some extent that didn't necessarily tell me. So the larger society has these battles over values and what's going to work too. And it's so important for an individual human to embark on that journey themselves because these things are too general. But you have conservative voices in any society that would say, listen, you need to wait and get to know somebody. And some are even more conservative, wait to be intimate until you're married and try to get married. And, that's extreme on one end. But you have on the other end, love the one you're with. And my parents came from that generation, that counterculture, hippie generation, love the one you're with. Not saying they lived that way, but that was the other extreme. And I would conveniently select the values that would justify the way I was living right then. And people talk about being a chameleon in their addiction, and that's what I did. And the ability to test out these values. So for me, what I found over time was that I did need to wait to be intimate. I did want long-term relationships. Now, you could argue some people, because of reasons of their own personal preference or the way they're built or whatever. I'm not here to judge that. They can go in and out of relationships. They can pursue sexuality in a way that doesn't involve relationships at all. It just involves sex. But that wasn't for me. And despite that being made abundantly clear by the reward systems and stress hormones, the way my body would feel through these experiences, I would continue to engage in those behaviors. Because once again, instead of feeling through what happened, I had a drug or a shortcut behavior involved with the lifestyle to medicate what should have been an instructive experience. So I would get in a relationship, it wouldn't work out because I wasn't picking the right person. I wasn't behaving correctly. I didn't know myself. I wasn't, in a cliche, ready for a relationship. And then it would end. And instead of taking the feelings that would come that should be instructive and say, hey, you should look at this and change the way you engage with women going forward, I would use drugs and just go meet another woman. I would obey the same value system that didn't work for me again and again and again. And that's just one example. I want people to disqualify themselves and say, well, I don't have that problem with relationships, so I don't know what you're saying. This happened with jobs. This happened with friendships. This happened with my education. I always wanted to be a writer, and I studied to be a writer, and I got a master's degree in writing, and I was well read, and I would write, but I would never submit my stuff for publication. I would submit it once, and I get a rejection and never submit it again. I wouldn't edit. I wouldn't honestly look at what my work was and actually be like, this doesn't work. Compare it to something that is published. I wouldn't do all that because I was so uncomfortable. And then when I would feel the uncomfortability of facing the fact that even though I was talented and had a lot of potential, I wasn't living up to the potential. I wouldn't face that feeling. I would go use drugs. So over time, this is the cycle, and people talk a lot about involvement of the body, but in that they make people out to be machines. Now, I'm not saying there isn't loops and cycles that are biological, that are almost mechanical, that involve drugs where your body wants the drug. But there's another level for me that's even more compelling and more meaningful that involves the story, the way we label our reality. And this is where the spiritual comes in. And to be spiritual, to me, and to talk about spirituality is to talk about what animates us as human beings. Like, what is our life force? And to me, spirituality involves what is called existentialism. I'm not going to get too deep into existentialism because I would go on forever, but existentialism to me is spiritual because existentialism involves a philosophy of how you face being alive, how you face existence. And spirituality does too. So it's like whether you believe that we have a spirit that survives death or not is irrelevant to that. We have a spirit here. And whether or not you think that that's, something magical, once again, that survives death, the substance, the characteristics of the spirit aren't as important as the way that that spirit functions in terms of a story that we tell about our life. Once again, what drives me? What gets me up? What do I have a spirit for? What do I live for? What do I yearn for? Like, these are all spiritual words to me. What do I love? What do I hate? What do I fear? What do I hope for? What do I believe in? These are all spiritual commodities that you can't necessarily measure. And none of these things were meaningful. They didn't exist coherently internally. Like, I didn't have a spiritual vocabulary. I didn't have a vocabulary of existence. I didn't have a vocabulary of purpose, a vocabulary of direction. I didn't understand that process that I described in a more kind of mechanical way of feedback from my environment. I didn't understand what it means to have disappointment, what it means to deal with unknowns, to face a life ahead, and to break that life into doable parts. Like, this all involves the spirit because it involves being able to transition from state to state. It involves surviving our emotions. and to engage in the behaviors that I've clearly identified associated with drugs, although I can engage in them without drugs. I can engage with them clean and abstinent and in recovery. To do those things is to often, once again, neglect the spirit, to neglect the answers to the questions that I've posed myself around what do I live for? And then more precisely, how do I live in a way that's honest with myself? So once again, if I see that certain ways of living don't work, that's going to affect my spirit. So my spirit yearns for love and for purpose and for connection. But if I'm not getting that love or purpose and connection through a job, through my relationships, through romantic relationships, through my creativity, through my hobbies and pastimes, if I don't honestly face that and try to change that, then I'm neglecting my spirit. My spirit is telling me, this is what you want and this is what you need. This is going to fill you up. This is going to make you happy. This is going to make the day endurable. It's going to make, actually more than endurable, it's going to make the day something to savor and enjoy. If that's not happening and I'm not willing to honestly look at that, I'm living in my addiction, for lack of a better word. I'm living in a lie. I'm living without freedom, without autonomy, without free will. So the process for me has been, I first had to stop doing drugs altogether, because what the people who talk about drugs affecting your body get right is that once that substance is in me, I'm going to be carried by that force. It's going to affect everything I do, and it's going to hijack. It's going to be, the metaphorical analogy is to possession. So by not doing drugs, I give myself a chance. But then I have to live in the feelings. And it's not just the feelings of withdrawal from the drug. It's the awareness of everything that got neglected while I was using drugs. The sense of being behind the eight ball, of being too far gone, to not having enough time, to being too late to the game, to being, whether it was when I was 30 or now when I'm 41, there's things that I didn't do or didn't learn about, and I'm still too scared to face, that other people have already faced, that other people have already gone through. And without drugs, I have a chance to look at all that stuff, examine it, and try to work on it and move forward towards some goals. But I got to take care of myself in the process. The blind spots that I have and the ability to lapse into denial, to negate everything I just talked about, is so easy. And so it takes me saying all this stuff out loud, for example, just in this audio, in order to come to a better sense of what the truth is of my own journey. A lot of the stuff I'm talking about hovers just below the surface. Now, a day is busy. A day is full of lots of influences. And this is what's so interesting to me about the recovery process. And it is a direct rebuttal to those who would say, just don't do drugs and figure it out. The process of recovery offers tools that are kind of the antidote to the way that the day works and the way the brain and the mind works in the face of the day. So if I wake up, I have a bunch of responsibilities to do. Those responsibilities are what's going to dominate my brain. So over time, if I need to actively be remembering everything I just said in this entire video, remembering that I need to set goals and I need to be aware of my emotions and I need to not get too disappointed. I need to treat my spirit and I need to face the challenges with strength and courage. I need to remember that I've had other challenges. All this stuff that maybe because I didn't learn it early on, it's not as internalized for me as it might be for the average human. The day will distract me from all that. It will pull me away from these truths that for me have to be asserted and reinforced and said out loud over and over again. In recovery, by writing things down, by talking about things. When we go to meetings, we share about it. When we help other people, we talk about our own experience in an attempt to help them, but we don't do it in a way where we're talking down to them. We're sharing what happened to us. That's how we reinforce all these truths we've discovered about ourselves. All the truths that we needed to discover in order to figure out what we were going to do instead of doing drugs, and to figure out what didn't work in the first place that led us to doing drugs. What all these truths that are the new value system, all these truths that are the new way of navigating the spiritual dimension of living, all the truths that are the new way to have purpose, all the truths that are the new way to face disappointment, all the truths that are the new way to be a human being having a human experience that is imperfect. that involves passing away to some extent. All of life is a preparation for death to some extent, and everything is temporary. So the temptation for all human beings is to flee from that. With addicts, it's to flee from life and death into an artificial existence where we feel like we just don't have to deal with any of that. But if there is any one spiritual truth, it is that if you don't deal with the certainty of living a life, of finding meaning in life, it will deal with you. People talk about that in the form of karma, like what goes around comes around, but it's deeper than that. It's a form of natural law that we are designed to be moral creatures. We're designed to be honest with ourselves and other people. We're designed to want to have virtues, to be strong in the face of suffering. This is what we all want at our core, with some exceptions. Only outlier personalities don't want this. We all want that. And if we don't face that need, other things come in. And this is a bigger picture analysis of human beings in general, not just those addicted. But with addicts, it's that for me as an addict, I wanted to be a strong person. I wanted to have virtues. I wanted to face life with dignity and purpose. And I couldn't. And that created a residue. It had an effect. It had a consequence that would just drive me further into what I was doing originally in the first place, instead of doing my duty and my purpose. That is the great challenge of my recovery, is to continue to face that question of what am I doing here? Am I doing it well? But at the same time, have compassion for myself when I fall short. It was a big picture talk, and maybe I could have done better with some details. At the end of the day, this was helpful to me. If anybody ever listens to this, hopefully it helps them as well.